Okay, so this is Mr. Blinker's Biology 11 class, Chapter 15, Section 1, The Puzzle of Life's Diversity. So what we're looking at in this chapter is sort of the introduction of the story where Darwin puts together his theory of natural selection. And the title's quite fitting, The Puzzle of Life's Diversity. Let's get into it now. Let's rock and roll. So when we look at evolution as a process, it's a process by which we look at everything that's developed up until today and we say, well, where did it come from? And in this case, it must have descended from proto-ancestors, ancestral forms. So when we talk about evolution more or less as sort of a sequence or a process, there is this idea of of things descending from ancient forms. If you've ever had a chance to take a look at fossilized skeletons, especially of hominids, things that are sort of human-like, you see a definite progression from something like Australopithecines all the way to modern Homo sapiens. It's very interesting, and I find this quite interesting myself, when I hear especially politicians talking about what a theory is. And they're bandying or sort of throwing around the term of a theory, and what they're really using it in the sense of is a hypothesis. We have to clarify the difference between a theory and a hypothesis. Okay, a theory is a well-supported and highly tested explanation. So if I believe, for example, that plants photosynthesize, I can put a plant in the dark, continue to give it water, give it fertilizer, give it nutrients, everything it needs, and it will simply die. And the connection at that point that can be made is light is required for the survival of plants. They need light to survive. Photosynthesis, as we know, cannot happen without light. Photosynthesis itself started with a simple idea, and it was called a hypothesis. And the hypothesis was light is required for photosynthesis. By photosynthesis, I will say PS. And that is the essence of a hypothesis. It is a yes or no question. It is something that you can test very simply. And my analogy was, put your spider plant or put your African violet in the closet and see how it does for an extended period of time without light. You can take away light, one single determining factor, and through a simple test, figure out whether or not your hypothesis is true or not. Now, more or less, that's the essence of the scientific method, testing one factor, checking to see if your scientific hunch or your hypothesis is correct. Now, let's go back to a theory, because I was talking about that originally. A scientific theory would be like testing many hypotheses, hypothesis plural, and getting towards the truth. Now, by theories, there's many theories out there that we can go to. You could look at the theory of plate tectonics. Oops, there we go. More or less, plate tectonic theory is also known as continental drift. Okay. You can also look at other theories, such as the theory of global warming. Now, there's a controversial one that isn't so controversial. And I always like to tell my students, if in the scientific community, and this is an interesting analogy, it's a seesaw analogy, if I put all the supporters, now it's not a popularity contest, but if I put 4 versus against as far as global warming goes, and it's a very serious topic, let me tell you right now. What would happen is that the scientists that are for global warming versus the scientists that are against global warming, there is a monstrous scientific consensus on this topic that we are affecting the planet. In other words, the fours have it. And the against would be the minority scientific voice. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that the people arguing against global warming are wrong, but there is a monstrous amount of data to suggest that it is correct that we are heating the planet, that the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are rising. There's a lot of theories out there. One of the theories, let's go to undo there. One of the theories that you have to pay close attention to is a theory of natural selection. Now, you have to take into consideration that theories are about one whisker shy of being a law. If we think about laws, we can think about, well, here's the easiest one that comes to mind right now for me, is something like Newton's law. For every reaction, there is an equal and opposite reaction. If you've ever fired a rifle and felt it butt against your shoulder, the reason it strikes against your shoulder is because the bullet came out the other end. You want to take this for a spin? Get in a chair, put your feet on a wall, and push against the wall, and you go in the opposite direction. Now, except for the friction which is slowing down your progress, there's an equal and opposite force acting in the opposite direction. You push against the wall, you go the other way. Laws are what theories would love to become. Just like in the sense of, I guess, Parliament, bills, if they could become debated, if they are debated and rise to a state where all the parties vote for them, they can pass and become laws. Look, in order for a theory to become a law, it meets sort of the ultimate test. And I always say to my students, imagine if you could attach a formula, right? If you could accurately predict, right down to, well, let's say my favorite example is that things fall about 10 meters per second squared due to gravity on our planet. That's very predictable. 10 meters per second squared, if you remove the force of air friction, things on our planet fall about that quickly. So, a hypothesis is a hunch, a theory is extremely supported by data, and a law, you've nailed it. You figured it right out. When, in the context of Charles Darwin, when we talk about this, we talk about the theory of natural selection. You hear this misused all the time, so I got to nail it. Charles Darwin found his Eureka moment, and it came with a little trip of the HMS Beagle, his ship, from England, let's say Great Britain, around Australia, cruising around Africa, and where it really gets interesting, we'll go down around the Horn here and up to a little unknown area called the Galapagos Islands. Now, that's a series of islands west of Ecuador. And if you don't know Ecuador, it'll come up a little bit later in my lecture, but Ecuador is a South American country which is located basically about here. So west of Ecuador, we have these little islands called the Galapagos. And it's a series of islands where there is a bounty of life, and it's very different. Every island has sort of unique conditions. Charles Darwin was lucky enough to take a naturalistic trip on the HMS Beagle around to the Galapagos Islands and then make his way back to the British Isles. What he discovered on the Galapagos Islands really sort of put things over the top. And here's what it was. This is back in the 1800s. Charles Darwin observed a great number of things, and he came up with sort of a hypothesis. What he was looking at were all sorts of things. He was looking at tortoises. Let's go back to good old classic blue here. he was looking at tortoises. Now, those are the turtle varieties that cruise around on land, and they've got a really big shell. He was looking at these interesting birds called finches, and they'll come up here in a second. And he noticed that there was a kind of tortoise that was different on different islands, and there was a kind of finch which more or less was just a variety of bird, but it was different on multiple islands. And in fact, on some islands, he saw many different varieties of finches. And what it was very intriguing was how they were feeding. They were feeding in very different ways. They were independent populations, and they had seemed to become, well, the term is segregated, independent populations, not only on islands, but within islands and within the tree canopy. He came up with an idea, and it was called natural selection. And what it was his hypothesis initially to explain why he saw so many different tortoises and so many different finches, because essentially they were the same kind of starting animal. Why are there different versions of tortoises? He saw ones with short necks, long necks, medium necks, and he saw finches with little bills which could fit in and grab insects, and then he saw finches with grander bills where he saw them crushing nuts and getting through the hard exterior of the nut, and he saw bills where these birds were ripping into fruit, and he said, why are these birds essentially the same thing, but why are there different forms? What is it that's making them different? And Darwin came up with a very interesting idea, his theory of natural selection. Here's our garden variety tortoise. A tortoise is always most noticeable by its really dome-like shell, and it is a land dweller. Okay, so if you've ever seen Finding Nemo, Crush was a turtle. Darwin was extremely intrigued by how animals in these environments were suited to them. And an interesting idea comes up a little later when we talk about one of Darwin's predecessors, Lamarck, is why a giraffe would have such a long neck. Like, where did the short neck giraffes go? Why aren't there any medium neck giraffes? Why is the extremely long neck of a giraffe favored? If you think about that one for a second, it has to do a lot with their feeding mode. But Darwin noticed that organisms that survived had traits that really worked well in the environment. And he came up with the idea that the environment picked the winners. Sounds a little crass, but it's true. If you don't have what it takes to survive in an environment, feed, and reproduce, you die. We'll get more into this in a moment. Now, as far as living organisms and fossils, Darwin was influenced by the scientific community and the data around him that was starting to discover these things called fossils. Now, in this case, let's see here, there we go. Fossils can be imprints of times gone by. And what you're seeing here is a fossilized plant. This is a fossilized trilobite. Think of it as a very interesting version of a horseshoe crab. And there's a lot of these. And he noticed that you could find these fossils in layers of the earth. Now, here's what you have to remember. As far as the layers go, the newest layers are the youngest. They're nearest to the top. And the oldest layers, well, they're down deep. So the deeper down you find a fossil, the more ancient it becomes. That makes sense. If you want to find lunch from 2 or 3 weeks ago, look on the bottom of your locker. It'll be collecting dust and probably bugs. So Darwin observed that the animals on these islands, let's say tortoises, finches, for example, were kind of similar, but they were different. And he was trying to figure out what it is that made them different. And he started to suspect that it was the environment in which they lived. These are very independent environments, pretty far apart. There you go. Each one represents its own kind of zone. Very different things, different vegetation, basically different biological experiments on on each island. So when he got to the Galapagos Islands, he saw such a diversity that he wondered where it came from. And the characteristics of many animals and plants varied noticeably, especially the finches. This comes up in particular detail. Interestingly enough, Charles Darwin was the son of a pastor. Now you can imagine coming up with the theory of natural selection, sort of the granddaddy of evolutionary theory, as the son of a pastor. Now that makes interesting conversation around the dinner table, doesn't it? Charles Darwin didn't publish his work the second he got back to England. He thought long and hard about it before he published it. And, of course, it was controversial because it was a very... it was a society in which biblical pretense was still very strong. Darwin wondered if animals on different islands had once been members of the same species. In a way, what he was thinking about was there some kind of ancestral version that had gone on and undergone modification? Was it like the branches of a tree? Did it change as it moved on? That was the essence of his theory, that perhaps there was an ancient ancestor, and I like to say proto-ancestor, of the animals that we observe now. So this picture of Ecuador is very geographically apt, because there are your Galapagos Islands. So when you look at ideas, like where did Charles Darwin really take his ideas and run? What might have influenced him? Well, Charles Darwin was pretty heavily affected by a couple of geologists, Hutton and Lyell, who studied geological processes. And what they had determined was that the Earth was changing. We have these forces, for example, such as erosion, and that can happen due to wind, and erosion can happen due to aqueous processes. And if you think about this, for example, we're from Prince George, we have a tremendous bowl-like region, and interestingly enough, let's pick a new color here. We have the bowl region of town, and we have some sort of large sort of hills in town, for example. And if we go back about 10,000 years, glaciers were busy carving out this region that we call Prince George. And as the glaciers retreated, if you look at what are called our cut bank regions, this whole area, even the area in which my house is located, was underwater. So the glaciers could have pushed up large areas of land and created sort of these hilltops. It's amazing what the power of geology can do. It takes a very long time. The last ice age during the Pleistocene era was approximately 10,000 years ago. It's quite well accepted that geological processes take forever. Look at the Grand Canyon in the United States, just how long that required to be carved out of the rock. How long did the water take to literally create that deep, deep canyon that amazes us all to the present day? Hutton and Lyell came up with the principles of geology, and sort of pre-internet, you have to understand that Lyell and Hutton, the second they published their work, would have been major news. And they really stepped up and said, no, the Earth isn't biblically, and no disrespect to biblical text, the Earth is 4.3 million years old as determined by radiometric dating. It's millions of years old, not thousands of years old. And the biological processes themselves could be equated to geological processes, as in taking a very long time to occur. So things on our planet could have taken a long time to develop, just like our geological processes, our Grand Canyons, and our, if you've ever gone off the tip of the Baja and seen the amazing sort of land formations down there, they take a long time to be carved out by the sort of amazing power of Mother Nature, specifically erosion. So Darwin knew that Lyell and Hutton were talking about change over time. So he thought, well, change over time, interestingly enough, if there's geological change over time, could there be biological change over time? So he found an interesting parallel. He was also influenced by a researcher known as Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, French researcher, who had looked at critters on our planet. Come here, you. There we go. And Lamarck's research predated Darwin's own, and Lamarck had looked at species and had seen, just as Darwin had, that there were fossils that were being dug up all over the world. And there were similar fossils that were being unearthed. And if you put the fossil evidence together, it was telling an interesting story. We found hominid-like species. Now, by hominid, I think I refer to humanoid, where they were a little bit different. Prominent brow ridges on top of over top of your eyes. Jaws that jutted forward in a pronounced way, but the skeleton still looked quite humanoid. When this description was sort of put to the test, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck came up with the idea, then this predates Darwin. Darwin knew that Jean-Baptiste had essentially said that living things change over time. Now remember, we're talking about a fairly biblical era, and that if things were changing over time, species were coming from other species. Interestingly enough, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, his theory is kind of that one thing turned into another. It's not like we had different versions, but Jean-Baptiste Lamarck said that one critter could essentially become another critter based on demands in the environment. And his classic example is that giraffes got longer necks because they needed them. So they sort of grew longer necks. So all giraffes, now this is a bit of an exaggeration, but all the giraffes grew longer necks because that's what it took. Now Lamarck had an interesting theory called use or disuse. So imagine a giraffe stretching its neck up as high as it can so that it could reach the top of the foliage so that it could survive, so that it could eat, so that it could have babies. Lamarck thought that these traits were then passed on to the offspring. Alright, so let's pop out of this for 1 second. So Lamarck, there we go, Lamarck giraffe evolution. So if you look at Lamarck's idea of the evolution of the giraffe, there we go, it was the idea that the original ancestor had a short neck, and in order to reach higher and higher, you see this again and again, that the neck just got longer. And that's kind of interesting. Lamarck, what he didn't seem to consider was, well, what about the short-necked giraffes that just starved to death? And I always talk to my students about breeding. Imagine if you killed off all the short-necked giraffes, if they never got to mate. Think about dog breeding, and we only bred the biggest dogs, and we kept that going. What would happen? How many small dogs would you get? Well, you might get a few, but if you only bred the dogs with the largest necks, give that a second to pop up, you would get extremely large neck dogs, or extremely large dogs, to sort of complete the analogy. So Lamarck believed that the neck of the giraffe got longer, sort of a vital fluid made it longer, and that as the ancestor of the giraffe got a longer neck, it passed that along to its progeny, to its ancestral inheritors. Now that's sort of convenient, but it doesn't really talk about survival. If you don't have what it takes, if you can't eat, you die. And if you can't eat and you die, you never mated. So your DNA is gone with you. So if what it takes to survive is to be tall and you're short, you're out of the game. You're gone. So interestingly enough, he comes up with this idea of change over time, where there's a tendency towards perfection. So with giraffes, we could say long necks. And he said the reason why it changed is because the giraffe was using the neck over and over again. It stretched, it got longer. Now, you might look at that and say, well, that's not really the reason the giraffes got long necks. All the short-necked ones died out. That's the difference between Lamarck's ideas and Darwin's ideas. Lamarck thought everything changed in this fashion, where they got long necks over time. Like that. About along the lines of this. Interestingly enough, what Darwin said was that, well, the environment was biased against the short neck and medium neck giraffes, and the long necks had an advantage. And that changed the giraffe. That's the difference between Lamarck's theories, which of course predate Darwin's, and Darwin's theories of evolution. So there we go. Interestingly enough, I pop out to the internet for 2 seconds, find the same picture. So Lamarck's giraffe undergoes a steady change, right, of a characteristic which just increases. Lamarck didn't seem to consider that maybe these guys just didn't have what it takes. Didn't think about that. Whereas Darwin saw that there would be diversity in nature. Now, if you've ever seen a fiddler crab, they've always got that one big claw, right? Reminds me of the movie Hellboy. He's got one big hand, right? And that claw, it wards off predators, attracts mates. You hold up your hand and go, hey, look at me, I'm awesome. I got this huge hand. Now, Lamarck's hypothesis would be that the claws were all getting bigger in all the critters over time, but so that all the progeny inherited that acquired characteristic, right? This acquired characteristic theory. Well, no, because when you think about modern characteristics, it's a blend. Not everybody gets the same characteristics. It's a little bit of a shooting match. There's a possibility you might get it. I am 5'9". My grandfather was 6'2". I've got cousins that are 6'7". Well, there's kind of this thing, luck of the draw. That's the way DNA works. These guys didn't know about DNA. The chance of getting height genes didn't come into their thinking, much less genes for the size of claws or the size of necks. So Lamarck came up with a neat idea that traits were inherited, and those inherited traits had somehow been acquired. So some ancestor got a big claw, so everybody got a big claw. So this predates our understanding of genetics. Lamarck did not know really in any modern way about DNA, genes, inheritance, segregation of chromosomes, etc. He had no idea. And he didn't know that just because a giraffe stretches its neck, that's a behavior. The stretching of the neck doesn't change the DNA. Just because that's akin to saying, well, I lift weights with my right and left arm, and that's my behavior. So my kids are all born with big biceps. No, no. It doesn't work that way. It has a lot more to do with what we inherit as far as our DNA and our traits. The difference is, we'll go back to the giraffe analogy. If you have to have a long neck to survive, you'd better inherit the right kind of DNA, or you're not going to make it into the next level of this video game. Darwin was also influenced by a population theorist named Malthus. Now, Malthus, interestingly enough, looked at the resources available to a population. And we know that populations are increasing. Okay? Populations are increasing exponentially. And an exponential curve has a chance of doing a couple of things. It either plateaus and crashes. It could crash. Or it can plateau and go up. Right now, we're on our world population. We're heading to 7 billion souls on our planet. And that's what Malthus was looking at. We only have so many resources. Space, mates, food, housing, right? Clean water. So it's called a Malthusian curve. And he was looking at exponential curves and saying, well, what was going to happen to the population? Now, that influenced Darwin because Darwin knew that resources weren't infinite. So resources such as food, space, right? Availability to have at the opposite sex and create progeny. Things like water. We get the idea. These are limited. And it affects an overall growth curve. Interestingly enough, this has a lot to do with economics. Supply and demand. If you like biology, economics might just be your thing. So, let's go out to Malthus. And interestingly enough, one little trek out to the internet, go to Google Images, you'll get a couple pictures of Malthus, and you'll get one of these. And this is a curve in which perhaps there is an increase in a population and it levels out. It levels out when resources start to get strained. It's like availability of an iPhone or a Galaxy S class phone. There might be a huge demand for it, but then it more or less it evens out. Maybe there's not enough phones for sale. You can't sell that many. It's got an economics equivalent. And there's a point of crisis where the resources available to a population start to become limited, and you could see that point right about here where those two lines are crossing. And that's very similar to supply and demand. If the environment isn't able to supply enough and the population is demanding, then that population is probably going to undergo a decrease, right? So, there you go. Living space, food, etc. You cannot go unchecked. Rabbits can't just keep reproducing in their environment forever. They'll run out of food. So Malthus pointed out something to Darwin, that populations might change, but it's not like they can just keep going in an unfettered way. Eventually, there's going to be a break on that. So Darwin presents his case as 15.3. I'll save that for my next installment because I don't think YouTube can handle more than 35 minutes of me, and nor would I want it to. And that's an interesting lecture where Darwin presents his case, and if you ever get a chance to watch YouTube biographies about sort of the after effects, the ripple effect of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, it's sort of like a time bomb in the 1800s. It's the dropping of a major theory which changes the scientific community forever. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I've gone through 15.1 and 15.2, and I'll reserve 15.3 for the future. Thanks for listening. Hope you found it interesting. And I'm checking out. Mr. B, signing off.